I thank the generous the introduction by Joseph, and I also thank Joseph, Yongeng, and other organizers of this wonderful event. What I'm going to present today is what I could have done on REIT while staying at NUS. And in fact, I'm still in Singapore. So I'm leaving Singapore exactly 1 week from today. Okay, so it was a really lovely time to spend 1 year. And then sort of motivation of why I wrote this paper, even though I'm not an envelope pushing researcher in this area. Is one very simple question. Singapore and Korea started REITs around the same time, 2001, around 2001. But right now, Singapore REITs is much bigger than K-REITs, Korean REITs. Not just bigger, about 7 times in terms of asset size. So if you compute that in per capita term, the difference will be huge. So what's behind that difference, even though 2 countries started the REITs around the same time? That was pretty much the initial motivation of this research. And then after going over various research outputs done by my NUS colleagues, David and others, I was wondering what are the international best practices? In other words, can we define the best REIT model based on the observation from US, Singapore, Japan, and other countries? Okay, so that was the underlying motivation. And then I'm from a public policy school, so I'm always interested in policy issue. Then if we observe some the best practices, what policy implications it may bring in developing a sustainable and welfare enhancing REIT system. So that's behind behind this paper. And then one thing, the last bullet, I completed this paper several months ago. Then after I complete that paper, I was fortunate to have various interactions with my colleagues at NUS, the industry participants, both in the US and Korea. So that was a very fortunate experience. So I will try to summarize those interactions as well. Okay, let's just jump into the material. The REIT, as many of you know, it started in the US in 1960. And at that time, it was a so-called passive investment vehicle, meaning that it doesn't have any internal management structure. It was a paper company. It started that way, and then it stayed as a small, non-listed the entity, corporations, for a while, until early 1990s. And then something happened in the US, both in the demand side and supply side of REITs at that time. So in the supply side of liquidity, various financial innovations happened. So REIT was not the only thing, but as we know, debt securitization, loan syndication, various special investment vehicles, some of the new hedging tools like credit default swap, they were all part of the financial innovation. And then it was not coincidence to see that the US REIT has grown explosively from early 1990s. And then it also spread to various countries. First to Asian countries, including Singapore, Korea, Japan. And then after the global financial crisis, it also spread to the European countries. Then in the demand side, demand side of liquidity in the U.S. The financial shock that we know, the savings and loan crisis, was a big push to change the corporate structure in managing large real estate portfolio. Interestingly, Asia and Europe have a similar shock, financial market shocks, in sort of jump starting with industry there. So in the case of Asian countries, the Asian financial crisis in late 1990s. In the case of European countries, the recent global financial crisis, they were behind to change the demand side of the liquidity. So I will get back to those points later on. And then why do we need the REITs? So the REIT is a for-profit corporation, but it is different from other usual corporations in a sense that it has a series of social functions. It should provide benefit in the society level, and one can have a different list, and I'm sure it's not the exhaustive list, but these three are the ones that I think as the important social benefits that REIT can bring in a country. So the first one is financial inclusion. The original intent of the REITs is to provide the investment vehicle for small household investors to large real estate projects. That was the original intent. And one anecdote I want to share is the story from my visit to NAREIT in the US last July, the National Association of REITs. So I met Brad Case, who is chief economist there. And then the interesting thing is they had three big meeting rooms. And then the name of the meeting room that we were in was Democracy. And then two other meeting rooms had the name of Liquidity and Transparency. So I think it symbolizes very nicely what the REITs are supposed to achieve in a society. Other than financial inclusion, we have the efficiency and transparency. This may be a little bit controversial, REIT's objective, but at least in the context of Korea, this is a very important issue. And I'm sure it will be similar in Singapore as well. In Korea, I computed the share of real estate asset in total fixed asset. So financial asset you usually get close to zero because one's asset is the other's liability. But in total fixed asset, the value of land and residential and non-residential structures in Korea amounts to 70%, nearly 70%. And I tried to compute the similar value in the US, and it was a little over than 30%. Then, given its size, how efficiently one can manage this whole real estate stock in a country is a very important policy issue. And then, as I will go into more in detail, REITs can solve that vehicle. The final one, a very important one, is the capital market acceptance. REITs should provide the stable, high enough, and low risk returns to capital market, especially to institutional investors. In our academic jargon, we need high alpha, high stable excess return, but low beta. There is a low correlation with the whole stock market. And as we will see in a minute, at least in the US, that trend seems to be holding. So those are the three what I label as a purpose of social purpose of REIT. And then there are a bunch of implementation tools. I'm not going to go over at this stage, including various ownership restrictions, the dividend payout rules, various tax rules, all that. Also the transparency regulations. And then only thing that I want to say about these implementation vehicles is that there is a wide variation across countries in terms of how to do it. Okay, so I will get back to this point as well in a minute. So how much time do I have, Joseph? It's until I just want to make sure I get to the last slide.
You have another
20 minutes, okay.
9:50.
9:50. Now, in terms of REITs model, I can identify basically two. You can categorize as three. But one model that I want to go over later is the US and Australian model. What I label as more capital market driven REITs model. In the US, the various REITs operational parameters, whether or not REITs have to be listed or what's the maximum leverage REITs can have, they don't have the across-the-board regulation. It's determined essentially by the capital market. Whereas in Singapore and Japan, which are among the top 5 REITs in the world at this point, along with the US, Australia, who adopted REITs much sooner. In the US, 1960, Australia, 1971. So they are the early adopters. Whereas Singapore and Japan, along with Korea and several other Asian countries, they adopted REITs in early to mid 2000s. Okay, then both countries, Singapore and Japan, they rely on sponsors, REIT sponsors. There are slight different nuance between Singapore and Japan in terms of who serve as sponsors, what roles they play. But given that the late comers in the REIT industry, the REIT sponsors in both countries seem to have served very useful role in initiating the system. Later on, they serve more roles, like shareholder of REITs, and they also own the management companies. And then in the case of Japan, thanks to the research of our colleagues, Masaki, it is shown that the REIT sponsor in Japan, they also serve as a rescuer when the REIT's in trouble financially, especially after the global financial crisis. Okay, so in going through some of the evolutions and some success factors identified in the literature, I will try to compare these two models. And then my ultimate question is this sponsor-based REIT system exportable to countries like Korea and others, okay? Evolution, okay, so I've already covered a couple of evolution issues related to the US. And then one thing that is very interesting from the evolution of the REITs in the US is that until early 1991, the market cap, which is shown in the bar graph, did not do much. It did not grow much, although the number of REITs has gone up from mid-1980s to early 1990s. That's because in 1986, U.S. had this Tax Reform Act, which made two very important changes in the REIT's operational structure. One is they basically make a level playing field between the real estate limited partners, which was a dominant form of operating the real estate portfolio in the U.S. before REITs. Then the second big change is internalization. They allow the internal management for the U.S. REITs. So then after that, the number grows, but volume did not grow much. But from 1991, there was a first IPO boom, REITs IPO boom in the U.S. So that ramped up the market cap, volume of market cap, as well as number of REITs for a while. But then the stage C, that's an interesting stage in that the market cap has gone up very rapidly, but number of REITs has gone down. So that's the phase of consolidation, M&As, consolidations through M&As. And then I had a chance to talk to one REIT managers in Singapore, who is from Australia, and he confirmed that the Australian REITs basically has gone through the same stage. First, internalization from external management to internal management. And then the second stage was consolidation. Basically, the average size of REITs got bigger in the second stage. And then it has gone down. The market cap has gone down due to the financial crisis. And then after 2008, it has another explosive growth from about 200 billion to over 900 billion. So currently in the US, there are some new areas of REITs, new operational areas like timber REITs. There are a couple of REITs based on timbers. So we know that REITs should be based on real estate, both in asset and income source. But someone can claim that timbers are part of real estate. Okay, so there is a sort of expansion of scope as well. But this very explosive growth, that reminds me of keyword. I want to hear the opinion from David about this very explosive growth, if you have a chance. Then several institutional attributes about the US REIT system, as well as Australia to some degree. In the US, they don't have a REITs law. It is essentially tax code enforced system. And then in the British tradition, that seems to be true. For other sort of, the British tradition countries like the UK, New Zealand, and Canada as well. Whereas most Asian countries and many European countries have special REIT law. So they can define more specifically what's the function of REITs as well as what are the restrictions that REITs can do. The second bullet is about the big change in the demand side. There is the SNL crisis in late 1980s and early 1990s. Was a very big shock in the financial market, as well as for the whole economy as well in the US. We know why that happened. It happened because of the prolonged inverted yield curve in the early 1980s. And because of that, more than 1,000 SNLs failed in that time period. And then that created a credit crunch in the lending sector. So then these REITs surfaced as an alternative for bank finance, real estate operation, and to some degree development as well. So as I mentioned, from early 1990s, there was basically paradigm shift in that it used to be a non-listed, private, and small size operation to publicly listed large size. Size matters, as I will discuss in a minute. There is a scale economy that was fairly clearly established in the literature. Then these publicly traded, sizable, with credible corporate structure, that was a big change, in managing the real estate stock in the U.S. Then, as I said, the various REIT operational parameters are determined by the capital market. Asia and Europe, very briefly. Asian REIT is booming. One statistics, simple statistics I want to share is there were about 300 IPOs between 2001 to 2010, based on one study. Out of 307, 132 are Asian REITs IPOs, and 35 from Europe. So IPOs from Asian countries, that is larger than those in US. 80 in the US, 38 in Australia, and 22 in Canada. Another very interesting feature of Asian REITs is the cross-border investment, especially the Singaporean REITs, as well as cross-border listings. There has been some attempt. There are already the REITs that are listed in multiple countries, mostly in Asia. But there has been more attempts. Some of the Korean REITs are contemplating the listing in Singapore, Hong Kong, and other countries. So going forward, these cross-border investment and listing would be on the rise. That is my sort of non-database prediction. But then, in the case of Asian countries, there was another motivation to have a REIT system. There is after the financial shock, some countries need to restructure corporate real estate holdings, basically to monetize their real estate holdings. That was true in the Singapore, Japan, as well as in Korea. But in Korea, they still have that legacy, CR REITs, corporate restructuring REITs. That takes about 30% of the Korean REITs still. So that's a little different aspect. So this is from my friend Professor Ong, and it shows that 2000 is the decade when many countries adopted this REIT system. And going forward, China and India are considering the system. They are talking about around 2017. So we will see how that evolves over time. Then some of the general attributes. Korean REITs are mostly the externally managed REITs, but sponsored REITs, is it really external? That's the question that we can pose. Under the sponsor level, I might just go to the graph first. So the REIT sponsors in Japan and Singapore, they play several roles. They are the investors, they are the shareholder of REITs, 30% of REIT shares, around 30%. They own REIT shares, and they also own REIT managers, the asset management companies and property management companies. And then in the case of Japan, they can support when the REIT is under financial distress. Okay, so they play multiple roles. Then is it really externally managed REITs? That's the one question we can pose. If under the sponsor level, it may be a fairly similar role as internally managed sort of REIT system under sponsor. But then the important thing is on the capital markets point of view, they need a credible business counterparty, whether it's a large internally managed REITs as in the US and Australia, or the sponsor-based REITs who can serve as a credible and reputable counterparty, business counterparty to the capital market players. And then given this sponsor system, at least in the US REITs literature, the sponsored REITs, not under the same name, but they have so-called captive REITs. REITs are affiliated with large corporations. They generally have a negative view due to the danger of various agency problems in property transaction and various the possible moral hazard problems. Then, because of that possibility, there is usually quite stringent restrictions and regulations on transparency. So I think you know these rules better than I do, but interested party transaction, property appraisers, disclosures, how many independent directors you have. So there are various restrictions related to the transparency of the REITs operation. Okay, so I only have 5 minutes left. So then a couple more points about the Asian REITs. The first one is in the case of Singaporean REITs, there seems to be a quite high degree of financial inclusion. And I have some indirect evidence, but in terms of institutional feature, the tax exemption on dividend income. I heard it's not just for REITs in Singapore, but it's generally the tax exempt for any dividend income. But I think that is a very big push for this financial inclusion. Plus, I was surprised to hear that from a student in my class in Singapore. They could purchase REITs from ATM. So that surprised me. It was not true in Korea. And that was also generally the case for stock acquisition. But that doesn't happen in Korea or possibly in any other country. So I think that increased the accessibility to REIT shares on the part of small investors. And then in terms of outcome, the share of REIT market cap in the stock market, that is much higher in Singapore compared to any other country. So in terms of market cap, it's 8.3%. In terms of turnover, transactions, it's close to 10%. So the Australia seems to have a fairly high share, 6.5, but 3% in the US, 2% in Canada, 1% in Japan. So this may be a indirect evidence that Singaporean REITs is doing pretty well in terms of this dimension of financial inclusion. Then cross-border investment I covered. And then one sort of lingering policy issue, at least in Korea, is the division of labor between REITs and real estate fund. There are some institutional stories behind, but the thing is, we know that real estate fund is more for high risk, high return, the projects, such as development project, whereas REITs are for the more stable, the real estate operation. But in reality, in Korea, the division is very, very much blurred. And when I visited REITs in the US, Brad Case told me it's pretty much same in the US. Generally, it is divided in the textbook, but in reality, the division is pretty much a line on the sand. Okay, so then success factors very quickly. REIT has a very stable and competitive risk-adjusted return. One thing that I want to mention briefly is this dividend clientele effect. What that means is that some investment cohort tend to self-select to income-generating value stocks rather than growth stock, like IT stock. Then this theory has a long history starting from the Miller Modigliani in 1960s. But recently, Graham Kuma, they published the paper in the Best Finance Journal, Journal of Finance, and they use the microdata to prove that the low-income and older investor cohorts actually prefer these value stocks. So that has an implication. They did not test the REIT stock, it's a general stock, but they found the tendency that the lower income, older investor cohorts tend to prefer these value stocks. So that has a very important implication given that Singapore, Korea, and other countries are going into very fast pace of population aging. So I want to just state that. And these are the sort of supplemental things. And then other success factors, briefly, the size matters, we already covered. Institutional investors, how much institutions involved. That tends to improve the REIT's performance. But then the question is, what's the balance? How a country can strike a balance between these financial inclusion of small investors versus involvement of big guys. So I don't think we have the answer to that. Probably that's further research area. Quality of corporate governance, some people develop these indices of corporate governance quality. And then the higher the quality, the more transparent in their operation, generally the performance is good. Then I will skip this. Diversification. I just want to make sure I made a brief comment on this. REITs diversification is a controversial issue. The diversification means you cover either more geographical areas or more asset classes. Then you need to incur the learning cost. Nothing is free to be specialized in a particular market. So in the REITs market, that has been an old debate. And then one sort of old evidence put out around the mid-1990s is that after 1993, almost all new REITs managers are specialized by property type, and all REITs IPOs, and all REITs managers tend to be specialized in property types. That's the old evidence. And then, right after my session, Professor Lin will share his current research showing that the MSA level diversification matters less than intra-MSA property selection in terms of REIT performance. So I think that's a sort of supporting evidence of all the sort of specialization story. But then the question is, do REITs have to be diversified in their portfolio, or diversification can happen in the investor level, in a sense that institutional investors can use specialized REITs in their whole investment portfolio to have the diversification benefit. So that seems to be one sort of analytical issue. Capital structure, only thing I want to say is that given the tax exemption status of REITs, okay, time's up, wrap up. the optimal capital structure for REITs, that seems to be a further research issue. And then another research done by David shows that the levered REIT return seems to be more cyclical compared to unlevered return. So implementation issues, as my time's up, I just want to direct your attention to this slide. I defined 3 dimensions of REITs benefit to a country. Then various rules and restrictions we can attach to each of those social benefits. Then Joseph Bui asked, before my presentation, he asked, what's the punchline of my paper? So this slide is a punchline. I think this financial inclusion issue is a country should ensure to have maximum financial inclusion by having a REIT system. There are many different ways to achieve that. But then this financial inclusion side of REITs operation seems to be pretty much unknown. There has been not much research has been done. So that's what I hope to see going forward. And then that's under the constraint of having a capital market acceptance with stable and high growth with top quality properties in the REIT portfolio. And then all the tax rules, transparency regulations, and other institutional details seem to be sort of secondary importance that can be developed based on particular conditions of a country. So why don't I stop here? Then I still have some Q&A or?
Yeah, the reason I asked him to keep his presentation short is because there are a lot of professionals here who are actively involved in REITs as well. So we have actually about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for discussion. Any questions from the audience who wants to clarify?
Can you go back to the previous slide? What is MSA?
MSA.
MSA?
Metropolitan Statistical Area.
Okay.
That's the city, urban area. Easy question.
Easy. Give you a tough question. Come on.
Chris.
You talked about this social.
Could you identify yourself first so that the audience know who you are?
So I'm Chris. I co-taught the module with Prof for the REIT students this last semester, and also a researcher at the Public Policy. You mentioned the social imperative, and I don't think of REITs. I don't think anybody has mentioned that topic ever before. Why would you raise that as an important thing? Because you said REITs are primarily a profit.
Right. So it's my subjective view, but the very raison d'être of REITs is is providing the investment vehicle for small investors. That's what I saw in the textbook. But in research findings and policy debate, I don't see. I'm with you in that I don't see much evidences, research findings, and policy debate. But I think this is what I have been saying to the policymakers in Korea. REIT is a for-profit company, but it is a special company in a sense that the tax exemption status is a carrot to achieve something, which I view as financial inclusion. So that's my sort of reasoning, and some people may disagree. So that's exactly what I want to hear more. What do you think?
I think it's been a one of the key reasons why Singapore has that high level of financial inclusion, in that you have tax advantage this asset class or this particular entity so much. I think the point is, like you made it, but I think it goes beyond that in the Singapore context, in that the cash flow is so tax advantaged out of the REITs, right? In Singapore.
I'm David Lang. I'm the next speaker, so if you get a chance to leave the room, you might want to. The conclusion of this issue in the U.S. is kind of interesting because initially the institutional ownership in REITs was relatively low, but now I believe it's 70 to 75% on average in the REIT industry are institutional investors, not the small, sort of local mom and pop kind of investors. Does anybody know what that percentage is in the streets? I don't know. And how, getting at this inclusion issue, what's the breakdown between institutional ownership and non-institutional ownership? What do you know?
I don't think we have the number, but I think the retail participation is still in general.
You speak louder a bit so that the audience can. Is that right? Yes. Thank you.
So I think if you see in the same similar in the Singapore context, you see a larger participation from institutional rather than yeah, I'm just going to add on to your earlier point. I think at the end of the day, the essence of the REIT is an investment product. What do you like to do, right? So, Genesis for example, not lecturers,
Yeah, okay.
Right. Yeah, now I was just going to add that the essence of the REIT actually is an investment product, right? So, so this inclusion thing is that you try to create a product, and ideally for retirement. So REITs is meant to be a stable vehicle, right? Except that I think the evidence so far in the Singapore market is that there's quite a high level of volatility, in the REITs market. But I don't think that's the original intent. It's meant to be a yield product, to deliver a certain level of yield in a stable form for people who wants to look for yield product. So from that perspective, is that if you have more retail participation and retail investors could see that as a good yield product, then you can get greater financial inclusion. I mean, if I can tell you that the REITs give you say 4 to 5% yield with a 2 to 3% growth, and there's no volatility, I think most people will jump at that kind of investment product, right? Because in today's environment, where you can get the kind of return. But it's the volatility that I think some people, may deter some investors. So I think, it's an evolution. I think the REITs have been here for close to 15 years. So hopefully over time there'll be greater participation and greater investment. I think we see a higher level of retail investors now compared to 5 years ago, and you get very intelligent questions from retail investors at AGMs these days, which means that they are beginning to understand the product much more, and they scrutinize and get very challenging questions. Yeah.
So I don't think I have to answer. I already revealed my position.
You mentioned this pathway of pathway of internalization as a precursor towards larger economies of scale through M&A. Clearly, that hasn't happened in this part of the world. And how much is the sponsor model that is so well developed in Japan and Singapore a barrier to that M&A process or the consolidation?
Right, so that's a very interesting point because I heard, at least in Singapore, but possibly in Japan as well, there were no REIT M&As. Whereas in the US, starting from late 1990s, there were fairly active M&A activities. But then, this is my conjecture, but it may have something to do, as you said, something to do with the sponsors. The REIT sponsors big and established business entities in both countries, it may be difficult. It may be difficult for other business entities to take over the sponsored REITs. But then there are non-sponsored REITs as well. So the question one can pose is why the M&A activity doesn't happen in Asian countries in general, whether it's sponsored or non-sponsored REITs. And then sort of textbook benefit of M&A is we all know, it's a sort of a selection process. It needs the sort of constructive destruction of less efficient business entities and create possibly bigger and more credible and efficient business entities. So that those M&As do not happen in this part of the world may not be that favorable thing in the long run. It may have to do with sponsor system, but I have no sort of evidence-based answer at this point.
We have time for one more last question.
Go back to, I'm Sunny Tan from REIT Association Singapore. Go make a broad question about the breakdown between institutional and retail investors profile in Singapore as REITs. Although we don't have the numbers, but by and large, you look at the sponsor shareholding in REITs in Singapore, it ranges from 20-35% generally. So you're talking about the free float, it's about 70 or 65%. I want to ask Prof. Mano, what is Korean's experience in breakdown between, do you have numbers on retail versus institutional? But before that, let me make one quick statement that for financial inclusion, so you want to reach out to as many as retail investors as possible. So in the case of Singapore, people in the street generally, when they buy stocks in the stock market, you don't really go after dividend stocks. Usually they go for growth stocks. People a little bit of gambling instinct, they want to see capital growth. Dividend stocks generally, I would say, is perhaps more suitable, as you say, the lower income is not probably right. The older people who are more conservative, who want to get a stable income. So in the case of Singapore, we have something like $250 billion in the CPF money. And when you look at the numbers of CPF, about half of them already invested in properties. We all take out money and buy properties. But still quite a big chunk of the $100 billion available for investments. And I suspect if you were even to take a small portion of that balance, 30 billion, that is enough to take out half the market cap of the S-REITs in Singapore, which now stands about 60 billion. So that is potential. Technically, if you have pushed the financial inclusiveness to the brink, then you have more and more Singaporeans using the retirement fund, SRS and CPF to buy into these dividend stocks, giving 6-7% dividend. And you actually can end up owning almost every stock of the REITs in Singapore.
Yeah, in case of Korean REITs, I don't have data either. But the needs for these financial inclusion through REITs, there is very very important pending policy issue, given that it is a fastly aging society and the pension system is not as good. Pension system in Korea is not as good as in Singapore or in Japan. But I suspect the extent of small investors' involvement in K-REITs is very small, mainly because K-REITs are mostly non-listed small REITs. There are many reasons behind that, but one of the main reasons is that big corporations in Korea, they still hold a lot of real estate, but they are not incentivized to create the REITs and put their properties in the public market. So the high quality income generating properties are currently not in the REITs portfolio. That is a potential catalyst. If they can invent a sponsor-like system so that they can incentivize those big corporations with large real estate holdings, then the Korean REITs have very good growth prospect. But that's sort of a related explanation. Okay?
Thank you very much. We will now proceed.